Welcome back to Cody Builds for part 2 of our short bed frame conversion on my 1975 Ford F150. If you missed last week's episode, I highly recommend you go back and give it a watch. In that episode, we discussed exactly how we were going to shorten this frame. We marked out our cuts, we made our cuts, and we took 16 inches out of the middle of this chassis. On today's episode, we're going to be preparing the frame, making our final adjustments, and welding the frame back together for good. So let's get building. At the end of last week, I left you with a look at what this frame was going to look like with a 16-inch shorter wheelbase. The first thing we're going to do today is pull the frame apart, prepare the surfaces so we have clean welding surfaces. Then we're going to actually treat the inside and outside frame rails where they actually meet, where they're going to be sandwiched to prevent any future rusting. And once all that's done, we're going to put the frame rails back together, align everything, and weld the chassis back together. The first thing I'm going to do here is pull the frame apart. We'll see how easily this goes, as we had to hammer it together at the end of last week, but I think with a little persuasion it'll come apart. Easy as that. We've got the frame separated. The next thing I'm going to do is prepare the surfaces that are going to be welded. I'm also going to be preparing the inside of the frame rails where these frames are going to be touching, and we're going to come back and hit that with the rust reformer paint before we do our final assembly. That's just to help slow down any rusting that might occur between those rails. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my angle grinder, 80 grit flap disc, and we're going to knock all the loose rust off the frame rails. So we got the overlapping faces of the frame prepped. You can see here how much cleaner this is. You can still see we've got some minor pitting in this frame. It's really not bad. I think the camera makes it look worse than it really is. But because we have that pitting in there, and that's stuff that those pits I can't quite get to with the flap disc. The next thing I'm going to do here is we're going to come in with some rust reformer paint, and we're going to paint down all the overlapping surfaces. We're going to give that a few minutes to dry, and then once that dries, I'll come back and I'll clean up our welding edges. So we're not trying to weld through the paint. That's a recipe for some ugly welds. So, but I do want the protection of the paint where the frames are going to be overlapped. So we'll get this painted up, we'll let it dry, and then we'll come back and clean those weld lines up. Now, the instructions on the rust reformer say to let it cure for 24 hours. So I'm not going to do that. I don't have the time to sit around and wait for paint to dry, literally. But as you look at this paint on the surface here, you can actually see it's already turning dull. When it goes on, you can kind of see on the top here, you've got glossy finish, and then this is all dull. As soon as all this stuff is down to matte black, I'm going to go ahead and send it. We're going to put it together and get to attaching the frame back together. So while that's going on, I'm going to get my welder set up, I'm going to get a few other things set up, and then once these frame rails will dry, we'll get the frame pushed back together and we'll start making our adjustments. Alright, our paint's tacked up on the frame, so I'm going to go ahead and slide the frame back together, and once it's back together, I'm going to mark where our welds are going to happen, and then I'm going to come back with the grinder and just knock the paint off of where those marks are, just to clean up the surfaces where the welds are going to happen on the frame. So, and then once we do that, once we get that all taken care of, we'll assemble this thing for the final time, we'll get all of our adjustments made, and then we'll bolt the frame together and do the final welding. So let's get this thing put back together. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark the outside of the frame where the weld's going to happen. So I'll come around this side so you can see that. I'm just going to run right down this overlap. Make a mark on the frame so I can see where I need to grind the paint away. I'm going to do the same thing on the inside of the frame on both sides. Then we're going to pull this apart one more time, hopefully one last time. Clean those areas up, and then we should be able to do our final assembly. We got the frame cleaned up. We're ready to put the frame rails back together. Now, this last time when we do this, what we're going to do is actually make sure our gaps are even on either side. Remember, we've got a gap between the back frame rails and the front. As we're bringing it together, we're going to be very careful to try and make sure that we have an even gap on either side. It's going to make bolting this thing together and aligning it a lot easier if we have an even gap on one side, on both sides, rather than having all the gap on one side or the other. That's really going to make alignment difficult. What I've done is I've got the frame side to side, so the gap here between these two rails and the gap here between these two rails is even. I've got the proper length set based off of my marks here. So we're measuring from the end of this bed mount back. I scribed a line into the frame. I actually scratched it in so the pin wouldn't wear off. So we're exactly 3 inches from the back of this hole to that line on both sides. And then the last thing I checked was for square. So the easiest way to do that, we're going to measure from diagonally from the back of this hole to the back of the bed hole over here, this bed mount here, and then we're going to do the same diagonally from the back of that mount to the back of this mount. Now I've already done that, and I'm exactly 56 inches in an X pattern there on both sides. So as of right now, the way it sits, we've got this frame squared up, and we've got it set to the appropriate length. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to leave my clamps in here. I've got these clamped down tight so the frame can't move on me. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to drill 2 holes, one at the top up here, one at the bottom down here, through both rails. We're going to run a bolt through on either side. We're going to do that on both sides of the frame. Once we've got the bolts in there, we're going to take turns alternating back and forth as we tighten these up to try and keep the frame square as we can. And we're going to draw these 2 rails together. Once we've got all the gap out of these 2 rails, then we're going to redo all those measurements, and we're going to make sure we're still where we need to be and make any adjustments if we need to make any adjustments. So I'm going to get the camera set up here. We're going to drill some holes and get these bolts put in. Alright, so I didn't have my 3/8 bolts weren't long enough, so I've got some 7/16 inch bolts here that are long enough. So I've got this top hole drilled out. I've got the other side drilled out as well, and I've got the bolt in there. The next thing I'm going to do, we're going to come on the inside of the frame here, and you'll see this hole here. I've already got a pilot hole here, or it's an original hole in the frame. We're going to use that. We're going to drill it out from the inside to fit our 7/16 bolts through the frame here as well. And then we're going to start tightening everything up. All right, we've got our holes drilled out now. So we've got 1 bolt in the front of the frame here, 1 in the back on both sides. Okay, so we're drilled out there. The next thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to take these bolts and start tightening them. I'm going to do the 2 front ones first. But what I'm going to do, instead of just jamming one down, I'm going to take turns alternating back and forth. Draw a little bit on this side, draw a little bit on that side, and back and forth until we get these things closer to where they need to be. That way, hopefully I don't end up skewing the frame one direction or the other. We're still going to make all of our measurements once everything's tight, so that's not an issue there. But just to be safe, I'm going to take my time and work back and forth across the frame. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to remove the top clamp here. I'm going to draw this first bolt in. Okay, I'm going to hit the other side now. Okay, I hit the two front ones. I'm actually going to put some tension into the back ones as well. A little bit on each side. All right, we're very close. I think what I'm going to end up probably having to do is tack the parts. Once I'll make some measurements here and make sure where we need to be. But I think what I'm going to have to do is tack the parts of the frame that are tight, because I've got it very tight on the inside all the way around on the back. The only place I have a gap is the top corner and the bottom corner here. And I think what I can do, once I have this where I like it, I can tack the center piece of this overlap in. Then I can use a hammer to knock this in. I can leave a little tension on this with a clamp, use a hammer and knock it in, weld, knock it in, weld, knock it in, weld. Get it tight where I want it, and then buzz the whole thing in. So now that I've got these bolts tight, I'm going to go ahead and redo all my measurements to make sure that we're still square and we still have the right distance in the frame. Yeah, right on, 3 inches. Perfect. Okay, that side's good. Same here, our index marks look pretty good. I'm going to tighten this guy down. Okay. Measure back, and we are right on 3 inches exactly. Okay, now the real test. Are we square? We're going to come back off of that bed hole right there. That's exactly 56 inches. Exactly 56. Measure back off of this one. .56 inches. Let me just double check that. Yes. 56 inches. Okay, we're square. All right, so I'm going to bring you in to show you this. We're nice and tight all through here. I start to get a little bit of gap right about here. Same thing, about right up here. I'm starting to get a little bit of gap. And the reason for that is, you know, these things are at least about a 3/4 inch gap on either side. And we haven't heated the frame. We haven't done anything like that. And we're trying to draw this rail in. So we've got it under tension right now. So we've got the center drawn in. and the top and bottom of this are flaring a little bit. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to tack as far up here as I can go right before we get to where we have a gap. I'm going to tack that up here and one down here. And then what we'll do is we'll just take a hammer and we'll try and knock in the frame a little bit here on either side. We'll weld in a little bit, knock the frame in, weld in, knock the frame in, do that all the way up until we take that gap out. And then we'll do the same thing on the other side. So we'll get all the tacks in first before we start beating the frame around. I'll tack the front, I'll also tack the back. Now inside of the frame here, we've got a really great fit. Everything's nice and tight, no gap, until we get to the very towards the top in here. I've got a very small gap, not very big at all, but that's for the same reason I have one on the outside here. So we'll do the same thing. We'll weld this as high up as we can without a gap, knock it in, and weld that shut. I've got all the chassis welding done now. So I'm going to take you in here and get a look. This is how it turned out. You can see just how wide the overlap is now. You can see the weld penetration through on the inside of the frame here. I left the bolts in for now. I plug welded all of the holes. I took off our braces that we had for separating the frame. To give you a look on the inside of the frame here, I think it turned out pretty good. Got everything welded up, plug welded on the back side, and you can see the heat transfer through on this side of the frame as well. So I know we got good penetration on all of our welded surfaces. So that's it. The chassis is now at 117-inch wheelbase. I double checked. I checked for square again, and I actually measured the full wheelbase of the truck, and it's right dead at 117, which is the appropriate wheelbase for a Dentside short bed. So yeah, that's it. The chassis mods are complete. I think the last thing I'm considering doing, and I'm not sure, I haven't decided yet, but I may come back in here with a piece of flat stock and just reinforce from this cross member across this joint here. I haven't decided if I want to do that or not yet. I don't know that it's completely necessary. But when I was notching the frame on the front side here, I did take a little bit more out than I needed to, so there was a little bit of a gap here I had to plug weld. And I was just thinking about frame strength across this welded joint, because all of our forces are going to be down on the frame. I don't know that it's fully necessary because, you know, we've got a full frame rail under here that will be combating those downward forces, which is the advantage of having the lapped frame instead of, you know, doing a butt weld or a Z weld, a Z cut method. So yeah, I'm going to think on that one. I've still got a few more chassis repairs to do. You know, we've got some bed mounts that need to be replaced. And so I'm going to I'll have that in a future episode when we do all the frame repair. In the next episode, we're going to be removing the rear differential, leaf springs, and the front twin I-beam suspension in preparation for the QA1 suspension conversion kit. That's going to do it for today's episode. So if you like what we're doing here, please leave me a comment, please subscribe, keep building, and I'll see you next week.